Munich, March 2012. In the district of Schwabing, the apartment of an 80-year-old recluse called Cornelius Gurlitt is about to be raided. Little did people know that what would be found there would open up a Pandora's box involving Nazi loot, degenerate art, and Hitler's own private museum.
Cornelius Gurlitt is not a name that would be familiar to many people until this year. He's someone that lived as a recluse in Munich in a very modest flat.
He's a bit of an enigma. He was a loner, but we don't really know much about him.
Well, he was a very interesting man. It wouldn't be surprising if he had a slightly strange upbringing and some effect from that.
He wasn't seen much out and about and was someone who hasn't even watched television since 1963. He's really lived completely a solitary life.
As the investigators poured through the collection of this solitary man, they uncovered over 1,000 works by the likes of Matisse, Picasso, Chagall, and Otto Dix, some of which were previously unknown.
There are things we think, where did that come from? You know, where has that been for the last 60 years? Which is, exactly what Cornelius Gurlitt wanted. Has lived a rather pathetic, lonely life with all these pictures. I wonder if it's all true.
When the story was broken by Focus magazine, it captured the world's attention. Who was Cornelius Gurlitt? How had he stayed undetected for so long? And just where did all of these artworks come from? The answer to all of these questions begins in the town of Zwickau in eastern Germany in 1930. Zwickau was the hometown of Cornelius Gurlitt's father, Hildebrand Gurlitt. He came from a well-known artistic family and worked in the galleries at the König Albert Museum.
Hildebrand Gurlitt was an art historian, a good art historian, and a dealer, and he worked for various German museums.
He was known as being someone who had close links with the avant-garde art world in Germany, with a lot of the modern expressionist painters of the day. The first exhibition he put on was Max Pechstein, which was, quite alternative at that time. And he worked with artists like Käthe Kollwitz, a lot of the expressionists. So he was seen as really quite radical. And I think, a lot of people enjoyed the exhibitions, but the kind of local traditionalists saw him as, this kind of radical young guy who'd come in and really shaken things up in Zwickau.
But with the Nazis coming to power in 1933 and Hitler's hatred of the modern art movement, Hildebrand found himself out of a job in Zwickau and forced by the Nazis to resign a new position he'd found in Hamburg soon after. Hildebrand was not welcome in this new cultural era of Germany. Modern art was declared an enemy of the state and culminated in the Entartete Kunst, or so-called degenerate art exhibition of 1937.
The Nazis really felt very concerned about modern art, the avant-garde in Germany at that time. And it's testament to how powerful that art is. It was a genuine worry for them. And they really wanted to outlaw it and ban it, and also use it, I think, for their own propaganda. As if you're against our regime, you'll end up like these people, you'll be mad, you'll be completely against the norm, basically.
When Hitler, in order to try and focus the German nation's psyche on its future and its purity and its superiority, and he wanted to connect the German nation in his definition of best forms of art, he ordered an exhibition to be held of all this degenerate art.
So they mounted actually 2 exhibitions at the same time. There was one of German art, really for the last 2,000 years. Then at the same time, down the road in Munich, there was the Antarktika Kunst exhibition, which actually had more visitors than the other one, unsurprisingly.
There was a huge exhibition held in Munich in 1937 with paintings which they despised, presented with slogans against modern art which were written on the walls. And this exhibition attracted 2 million visitors in Munich, which is an amazing number. And it then went on to tour other German cities. But it is most unusual to hold an exhibition of art that you despise.
I think a lot of the journalists at that time who had been closely linked to avant-garde circles found it really hard because they were under pressure to write very scornful and scathing reports about the exhibition, saying how horrendous all this work was.
Can you imagine, if somebody put on a show of sort of accepted British art now, and then art you're not allowed to see? Of course, you go to the one you're not allowed to see. I mean, the kind of hideous art.
There were many people who went to see it, and many were horrified by it.
It was absolute chaos in there. Everything was hung, stacked up on the walls. Paintings were lopsided. Things were propped against the wall. Some were unframed, some were framed. And they had graffiti explaining why each work was degenerate. So even if you couldn't figure it out for yourself, you were told. Whereas in the other exhibition, it was all very classical, monumental nudes representing classicism and longevity, all the things that Hitler wanted to build into his Aryan race.
4 times as many people went to the degenerate art show as the Corso show. And maybe Hitler was a secret modernist, who knows? I mean, certainly he exposed more Germans to modern art than would ever have seen it if he hadn't put that show on.
The Antarktika Kunst exhibition was organised by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels.
Deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
And some of them went to look at it because they thought they'll never see it again.
There had already been the book burnings earlier that year where they'd burnt works by many, many modern writers. So really it was maybe a death knell to those avant-garde artists and their work. So a lot of people who sympathised went at the same time as a lot of people going just to have a kind of scoff and laugh at it.
There were several reasons why the Nazis despised so-called degenerate art. Hitler himself personally was very, very conventional in his artistic taste and disliked modern art. Some of the artists who made the modern art, like Chagall, for example, were Jewish, and the Nazis obviously despised them for that reason. And there was also a very strong streak of conventionality in Nazi thought. They espoused old-fashioned traditional values, and modern art seemed to just run counter to that.
The era of degenerate art may have ended Hildebrand Gurlitt's promising early career, but he had even more pressing concerns.
He did have kind of Jewish blood in him, which would have made him slightly vulnerable to the Nazis.
He was what they called a second level Mischling, wasn't he? So I mean, he was a quarter Jewish. It was probably better to play along.
Hildebrand's heritage and his love of modernism would have seemingly ended any chance of a career in the art business. But amazingly, he was hired by the Nazis to work as a dealer on behalf of the state.
When the Nazis were getting rid of degenerate art, he was singled out as one of a handful of major dealers who were entrusted with the task of selling off the art. So that's where he got quite a lot of his pictures, and he was quite interested in modern art.
He was able to ingratiate himself with the Nazis because of his understanding of the whole of the Jewish and other collectors of that current generation of art, and become one of the main individuals who helped them loot art around Europe.
He went on to work with the Nazis as one of 4 dealers who were charged with basically making some money out of the modernist or degenerate art as they saw it. I think there's a quote that says something like, "We've got to make some money out of this rubbish." So they just wanted to get it out of Germany and sell it off and get foreign currency in as well.
He would argue that he'd saved some of the art by selling it off to foreign collectors rather than allowing the Nazis to destroy it.
Hildebrand had a talent for gaining access to artworks. and he was soon buying pieces directly from those who had to sell as they were being persecuted or were forced to flee the country.
This is my offer for all 9 of the drawings. It is a fair offer, I believe. Good. Good. I'll arrange collection, handle all the details.
It's very difficult to get inside the minds of people, and it was a very difficult period, and people did things that we would now regard as wrong in many cases.
The art will be safe, at least.
It is the art that you're saving.
Yes, of course. They've already dismissed me from my gallery. If they think I'm offering generous terms, I have a family. I'm a quarter Jewish.
One doesn't know precisely why he dealt with the Nazis, but the most obvious reason is that it was a way of making money.
This was a very comfortable, easy life that got him out of all the problems of the rest of the war. And the money must have been extremely good at a time when, unless you were in the armaments business, it was very difficult to make any money.
I'll send my man for the paintings this afternoon. Doctor?
Hildebrand Gurlitt would soon become one of the biggest dealers on behalf of the Nazis. The choice he had made would take him to Paris, where his mission was to acquire works for the Führer's own personal collection from Nazi-occupied France. The 2012 Munich artworks discovery had thrown light on the life and career of the man who had acquired the collection, one Hildebrand Gurlitt. He had started out as a respected museum director, but with the Nazis coming to power, he became a key part of the commission for the exploitation of degenerate art. Works were bought directly from those being persecuted and were seized for the Entartete Kunst exhibition. Hildebrand was able to build up his own collection as he worked to sell these so-called degenerate art pieces abroad, from where they were stored in the Schönhausen Palace near Berlin. In the process, he was able to hoard many works for himself. This is how a number of paintings by the German artist Otto Dix, who featured heavily in the degenerate art exhibition, wound up in Cornelius Gurlitt's apartment in Munich.
Otto Dix was heavily featured. Obviously, his work is quite shocking visually, very caricatured. People saw it as really horrifying, couldn't understand why he would choose to represent the human figure and face in that way.
During the First World War, Dix was very shocked by what he saw, and a lot of his pictures show the savagery of the fighting. And the Nazis despised his paintings as degenerate, and he was categorized as such.
But another artist that was interestingly very vilified was Emil Nolde, who actually had been a member of the Nazi Party and a real sympathizer from quite early on. But he was the artist that had the most works of any of them, had 27 works featured in the exhibition, and he was the one that had said, you know, I am a Nazi sympathizer, I stand up for what you believe in. And there's a very sad story about him. He was very elderly, going to, after the exhibition, going to the authorities and saying, you know, I'm a sympathizer, please can you release my work? And they refused. And he had very important crucifixion work, which they wouldn't give him back, despite his allegiance to the party.
The label degenerate even applied to music, with an Entartete Musik exhibition also being staged. It was a bizarre and terrifying time for anyone working in the arts in Germany, and Hildebrand Gurlitt was caught right up in the middle of it.
I think we all want to see the kind of Nazi epoch in terms of black and white, and I think a lot of people were both black and white, and certainly before the war, he was incredibly white. He was passionate about modernism, and then the next thing you know, he's in Paris expropriating art from Paul Rosenberg and the Rothschilds, and, you know, doing rather kind of dreadful things.
It was in Paris that Hildebrand took full advantage of his new position of power. The Entartete Kunst exhibition had made some of the best modern expressionist paintings available. But with the Nazis having taken control of France, some of the greatest art of the era was within reach.
Paris has always been an important centre of the art market, particularly in the 20th century. So it's no surprise that a German dealer would have very good and close contacts with Paris and spend time there.
The best art of all belonged to Paul Rosenberg. He'd managed to escape just in time, but the same could not be said for his whole collection.
He's an incredibly important dealer and came from a family of dealers, so he really had it in his lineage. And he was most famously Picasso's dealer from 1918 to 1940.
He and Picasso were like sort of family, weren't they? They lived next door to each other and they spent holidays together, and it was, you know, it was a love thing.
He was also a dealer for Matisse from 1936. So he really had the big names, and his gallery was on Rue La Boétie, and it was really known as the kind of hub in Paris of these modern artists that were breaking the mold. You could find them all there with Paul Rosenberg.
Rosenberg was one of the most important dealers, particularly in modernist works, the post-impressionist, early 20th century works. He was among the most important dealers for that period.
Well, he was kind of Mr. Cubism, really, wasn't he? He and his brother Léonce were the big sellers of mid-period Cubism, and they internationalized it. And they, you know, they opened a gallery in London, a gallery in New York, and they sold Museum of Modern Art, and were, you know, had massive collections and were massively rich.
When things became more tense in Europe, he started to get nervous and did ship off a lot of his collection, which was very, very extensive. So it went to South America, Australia, and also to London and New York to his galleries. But unfortunately, he didn't get everything out. And in 1940, he fled to New York, managed to get a visa, got his family out very quickly, but there were, I think, over 2,000 works left.
Paul Rosenberg's confiscated collection, along with all other art labelled degenerate in France, was stored at the Jeu de Paume Gallery in Paris. Hildebrand Gurlitt was then able to purchase these works at knockdown prices at the nearby Drouot auction house.
Many sales were made at the Drouot auction house, and that continued during the Second World War. And it was a place to trade in the work of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists.
Between 1941 and 1945, while Gurlitt was living and working in Paris, he was able to add top-quality paintings to his already impressive collection. But as the tide of the war turned against Germany, he needed to find a way to keep them for himself.
As chaos reigned towards the end of the war, from about the early 1944 period, when it was clear that the war was lost and the Russians were approaching, there were a lot of people who spent most of their time thinking about how they're going to survive at the end of the war. And for somebody like him in a very privileged position to move art to secret locations where he could say he was trying to sell it for the Nazis, but actually he was keeping it for himself at the end of the war.
Having noted the warning signs, Hildebrand Gurlitt moved swiftly and managed to relocate much of his art collection away from his home in Dresden.
They were kept on a farm outside Dresden, and then they were in some sort of nameless castle in some nameless town in nameless southern Germany. It doesn't seem to me a collection that was put together with love. You know, it seems a kind of expedient collection. It looks like the kind of collection that was designed to be sold quietly, not raise too many eyebrows.
It was fortunate that Hildebrand was able to get the works away from the city of Dresden, given what was about to happen. With the Allies approaching, the firebombing of Dresden provided him with an ideal cover story.
Well, he had a home in Dresden, and actually his street was bombed, so I think Hildebrand saw it as a very obvious and clear solution to their hoard. I think they just said, our street was bombed, all the records have gone, all the art's gone, we don't have anything, we have no letters, we've got nothing. And it made complete sense because it was actually bombed and no one knew that. I think Hildebrand had actually taken the art out at the very, very last minute when the Allies were approaching. So there was no reason really why it wouldn't be true that it was bombed.
Hildebrand Gurlitt had another secret, though. He had been hired to find works of art for Hitler himself, and in the process had greatly expanded his own collection. His pretense that it had all been destroyed in Dresden was successful. For over half a century, the hoard was considered lost to the world. And it would have remained so had his son Cornelius not tried to sell one of his paintings just a couple of years ago. A sale that would see the net begin to close in on this 60-year-old crime. The firebombing of Dresden could have wiped out most of the artworks found in Cornelius Gurlitt's Munich apartment in 2012. But his father, Hildebrand Gurlitt, had been smart enough to transport his collection of over 1,000 works away from the city. When World War II came to an end, Hildebrand had managed to get away with storing these artworks in a secret location, thought to be on the outskirts of Dresden. He was able to return to his pre-war career in the art market, but died suddenly in a car crash in 1956. His son Cornelius then succeeded in moving the cache of works into the Schwabing apartment in 1960. They remained here for over 50 years, where every night Cornelius would take the paintings out of storage to admire them.
Well, it does seem that he just inherited the pictures. The son enjoyed them privately and would look at them and saw no reason why he should sell them or do anything with them. So the status quo continued and he just took over his father's picture collection.
Anybody who is the son of somebody with as extraordinary a career as his father, and the constant moves and times that his father was under suspicion and worked for both the Nazis and the Allies, he must have known that his father had been playing both sides of the street. And that may well, I think, have set up various tensions within him.
Cornelius had remained hidden from society for all this time. But with no state health insurance in his old age, he was forced to enter the art market himself and sell one of his paintings for much-needed funds. Spending so much time alone, Cornelius was known to write what he intended to say on cue cards when faced with a conversation.
Good afternoon. This is the painting that I wish to sell. Good afternoon. This is the painting that I wish to sell.
Cornelius Gurlitt decided to part with this important work by Max Beckmann, the lion tamer, because he was getting increasingly ill. And I think really out of desperation, he just decided to sell one via an auction house in Cologne. The auction house sent a representative, as they do, to come and do a valuation, and she came in expecting, I'm not sure what, and to a very gloomy, dark flat.
Mr. Gurlitt, I'm Ms. Ballman from the auction house. We spoke on the phone.
Yes. Come in.
She had no inkling of what else was hiding in that flat.
How did you come by it? Was it in your family?
My mother's.
You don't have any more then?
No, this is the only one. This is the painting that I wish to sell.
Well, when it was taken to the German auction house, Lempertz, it was very clearly in the provenance. His father's name was up in lights, and his father's name is on our red flag list. Any picture we see anywhere in the world with his name, we undertake extensive research. So it would have been immediately obvious to Lempertz that this picture was claimed by the family of the victims of the original persecution. And so the normal thing then is to contact the family and to say to them, this picture's coming up for sale, and there is a deal that could be done whereby you should get some of the proceeds. Whether they knew at the time the exact circumstances under which he'd held it is probably doubtful. They probably thought he'd got it in possibly good faith. That's highly debatable now, I think.
He made an arrangement with the heirs of the pre-war owner, so they agreed to split the proceeds, and it just went on the market as a normal picture and wasn't particularly closely examined.
I would like to know what was in the collection in 1956, before Hildebrand died, and how much of that has been sold off quietly in the intervening years.
But by selling the Lion Tamer, Cornelius had started the process that would lead to his eventual downfall. He was merely following the example of his father Hildebrand, though, who had been expected to generate funds by selling modern paintings. But he also had another major role: to purchase or otherwise acquire works for the Führer himself. Hitler had grand plans for his own purpose-built Führermuseum in his hometown of Linz, and he needed the greatest works in history to fill it. His desire to make a mark in the art world had started from a very young age, when he first moved to Vienna in 1905.
When he was young, Hitler wanted to become an artist, and he applied to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and was turned down twice.
He was rejected straight out without even an interview, so he really got a slap in the face from that.
He felt rejected at a crucial point in his career. I think that made him dislike the art establishment, and by this time the art establishment had been seen as supporting the development of modern and 20th century art.
He does believe that there is a kind of a world conspiracy, not specifically against him, but against people like him, people with his kind of taste, and it's these nasty, interchangeable, sort of deranged Jewish Bolshevik folk who like that kind of painting.
Vienna, at the start of the early 20th century, was the home of a bustling new artistic community that Hitler simply did not fit into.
In Vienna, there was no doubt there was a very libertarian, rather degenerate feeling to the city. And it's quite clear that in Vienna at the time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was falling to bits.
I think it's what had happened in Paris sort of 25 years before. Was you'd had a kind of imperial heavy hand suddenly, in the case of the French, was lifted by Napoleon III being got rid of. In Vienna, it was just, poor old Franz Josef had been there for 50 years by that time. And I think also it was the city of Sigmund Freud, because one thing that all of these things have in common is kind of psychic introspection and a kind of an idea of the possibility of madness. And that, of course, went down like a cup of cold sick with the Nazis. They didn't like that sort of thing at all.
I think in Vienna what was incredible was a real mix of all the different arts, as it were. So there was the birth of atonal music happened in Vienna. You had a new psychological study from Freud. You had artists like Klimt, and then the next generation following him, showing an emotional response to art that was about the internal rather than the external. So it was coming from all directions. It was music, it was theatre, it was literature, it was art. It was a real sort of hotbed for this new avant-garde, a new way of seeing and thinking.
There was some great work done in mathematics and science. There was some great work done in psychology, but you can see a lot of people would have felt that that was all pretty strange and a bit unsettling. And there was some, in many ways, great art, but what would be to them, and even now, rather shocking in some ways.
It was very exciting, the early 20th century in Vienna. I mean, culturally, there were a lot of avant-garde artists who were really pushing the boundaries. In Vienna at the time when Hitler was living there in the earlier 20th century, there was quite a conflict between the avant-garde and the traditional art, which was the art that Hitler espoused.
Hitler's traditional style, which included watercolours and drab sketches of the sights of Vienna, were not going to cut it in this new modern art scene. But his enormous political success allowed Hitler to finally fulfill his artistic ambitions with the construction of the Führermuseum in his country of birth, Austria.
The Führermuseum was going to be in Austria in Linz, which was the hometown of Hitler, and he really wanted to construct this enormous pantheon of the culture of the new Reich. It would be an art museum, but not only that, a library, opera house, theatre, everything to do with his new imposed culture would be here in this enormous, great symbol of his power.
He's not the only man, he's not the only megalomaniac man who has seen that a museum is maybe the best way to have your name set for posterity.
As ambitious as the Führermuseum was on its own, it was actually only a part of the grand restructuring of the entire city of Linz.
Really quite early on in 1936, he had already spoken to his head architects at that time.
It was going to be 500 feet long, you know, Arbeitsschwer, lots and lots and lots of columns, peristyles, all the usual Nazi claptrap.
He pored over the plans, pored over what works he wanted to get, and then he went on a rampage across the countries that they were invading, taking works from Jewish families, from museums. A lot of religious art was taken from churches, even in Germany, and stored them at that time ready for the Führermuseums.
And it was a kind of degree of thought that went into it, because it was, you know, it was going to be the central museum of the Reich. It was going to have a collection that effectively showed the whole course of art history leading to Germany.
Every single masterpiece from right across time would be housed here in that museum.
And people were going to come from all over the Reich to Linz to see it. So there was also the Adolf Hitler Hotel as part of the complex, because of course they would have to have somewhere to stay when they got there.
One of the people entrusted with acquiring works for this audacious museum was Hildebrand Gurlitt. During his time in Paris, Gurlitt was a big-time buyer who acquired major works. He even spent 5 million francs on a Cézanne landscape painting of the Vallée de l'Arc, which later proved to be a fake. But he wasn't alone in trying to acquire works for Hitler. Dr. Hans Posse, a close confidant of the Führer, was tasked with seizing the most challenging paintings to obtain, including works by Johannes Vermeer.
Hitler's taste ran mostly to German and Austrian romantic 19th century art, so I imagine there would have been lots of Caspar David Friedrich and that sort of stuff. But the chap who was buying for him was a great expert in Netherlandish and Flemish art. So I mean, there were two Vermeers, for example, and there were going to be lots and lots of the odd Michelangelo, big stuff.
If you're going to found a museum, you've got to have, if it's going to be the great pictures of the world, some of the great Dutch and Italian masters.
There were two masterpieces by Vermeer which were destined for the Führermuseum, one of which was bought and one of which was stolen. Now, the bought one was called the Artist Studio, very, very important work by Vermeer. And Hitler actually bought that directly from Count Czernin himself for quite a lot of money, but his descendants are now contesting it's still a case that's going on as we speak. The other was stolen from the Rothschild family as part of the hoard taken from them.
The Führermuseum, along with other grand schemes for the reconstruction of Linz, never got past the design stage. But many artworks had already been acquired, ready to be moved in. They had been stored in Munich, but with the threat of bombing, the hall was moved for safekeeping to a salt mine in the Austrian region of Altersee.
They were boxed up, sent there, and no one really knew much else about it.
When the war in Europe came to an end, the Allies managed to track down the salt mine in Altersee. Inside, they were able to recover both the astronomer and the artist's studio. They also managed to reclaim a stolen bust by Michelangelo and the priceless Ghent altarpiece, all of which were taken in preparation for the Führermuseum.
The Ghent altarpiece was a seminal work, I think that's the right expression, by the Van Eycks, and it set a tone and a procedure for things that makes it historically enormously important. But I think perhaps the most valuable painting taken during the war were those various Vermeers that were stolen individually.
Even for Hitler getting hold of Vermeers and pictures of that quality, not easy. I mean, it's just really very fortunate that those were not destroyed. I mean, there were quite a lot of very good pictures, which we're pretty certain were destroyed, i.e. there's records of where they were, and it's known that that place was bombed or damaged or flooded or whatever, and the pictures were destroyed.
Just as Hitler's secret hoard had been recovered at the end of the war, time was running out for Cornelius Gurlitt's stash in his Munich apartment. And a trip to Switzerland would prove to be his final undoing. Until 2010, Cornelius Gurlitt's remarkable cache of over 1,400 artworks was still unknown to the world. He had managed to successfully sell the Lion Tamer painting by Max Beckmann for quick funds. But his luck started to run out when he was stopped at a customs point on a train from Switzerland.
Well, Gurlitt was on a train and from Zurich to Munich, and he was stopped by German customs officials who were just doing, we believe, just doing routine checks, and he was found to have a substantial amount of cash with him.
He had on him 9,000 euros, which is just under the limit of what you have to declare coming out of Switzerland. This was a train from Zurich to Munich. And then they looked for his identity papers and this, that, and the other, and he appeared to be a rather strange individual, hence the Germans then raided his flat.
He had no tax references, no health insurance. He's someone who's been kind of completely off the radar of the German authorities. So they were quite surprised to find him with this huge loot.
I mean, I think, they thought, why is this old man carrying 9,000 euros from Switzerland? As I say, it's an entirely legal thing to do, but I suppose it raised questions. I must have flagged him up on some horrible tax database somewhere.
I would not be at all surprised if, in fact, his name was on the list of those individuals who had Germans with bank accounts in Switzerland. There have been some whistleblowers in the Swiss banks who gave these lists of names to the American and German intelligence services. So I wonder whether, in fact, they hadn't spotted him, as it were, from one of those lists.
When will you bring them back?
Finding 1,400 works of art in Germany is just the start of the treasure hunt. The cramped London offices of the Art Loss Register have been besieged ever since German prosecutors announced the discovery of works by masters such as Marc Chagall, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso. The race is now on to find the rightful owners.
Well, what is unusual is the sheer size of the collection, 1,400 pictures and drawings.
Ranging from works on paper right through to oil paintings. It's got a lot of the German expressionists in there, people like Emil Knowles, Max Pechstein, right through to Picasso's, Matisse's. So it's really quite broad, and it's said to be of value over €1 billion.
It's slightly unfortunate the whole thing was kept very quiet for about a year or so, and it only emerged later when a German magazine discovered what had happened and published a story that it came out. And I say it's important to come out, but if there are claimants for the pictures, it's important that they're all recorded publicly so we know what's out there.
At least one of the works found in the Munich apartment, a Matisse painting of a seated woman, is thought to have belonged to Paul Rosenberg.
There's been a lot of criticism on the case that there haven't been very detailed inventory released, which is against the established policy of how you should deal with stolen art. And the family of Paul Rosenberg are already questioning whether this is their seated woman.
The recovery process of Paul Rosenberg's stolen paintings has been long and arduous. It started right at the end of World War II with Rosenberg's son.
Lieutenant Rosenberg was the son of Paul Rosenberg, who was the Parisian dealer who fled to New York at the start of the war, who had been the dealer for all these great Matisse and Picasso and people like that. And he found some of his father's pictures, and as well as all the other things. And it's fascinating.
I mean, there's still 70 Picassos missing, aren't there, in the world from the war. And lots of Paul Rosenberg's collection is still unaccounted for.
But that's a separate part of history, because then Paul Rosenberg's granddaughter is Anne Sinclair. She's a wonderful lady, and she's pursuing the pictures in her own way through the courts, and is actively involved in that at the moment. So you can see this evolution of how the stolen art is recovered. If it belongs to Anne Sinclair and her family, the descendants of Paul Rosenberg, then I think they have every right to make a claim for it.
However, just 6 months after his story was revealed to the world, Cornelius Gurlitt passed away following ill health after heart surgery. During that time, it was discovered that he held even further paintings in 2 properties he owned in Austria. These included works by Renoir and Monet. In a surprising twist, though, the Bern Museum of Fine Arts revealed that they'd been named the sole heir of Cornelius Gurlitt's collection, despite him having had no connection to the institution during his lifetime. But the restitution process of many of the works in the collection could continue for a long time.
It's extremely complex working with restitution, tracing back and trying to figure out who actually owns these paintings and in what circumstances they went from the family or owner pre-war and into the hands of Hildebrand Gurlitt. So it's going to be a lot of research, very detailed, and who knows how long it's going to take, and actually if we'll ever know the full history and provenance of every single work.
Well, I think one of the lessons of this is that the art trade has to be more open, and people buying at auction have to ask more questions about the works. This is happening more now, and there's been increasing focus in the last 10 years on provenance. But I think the Gurlitt case shows the importance of monitoring it carefully and people asking questions.
By and large, the rule of thumb, so far as right and wrong is concerned, is if the Nazis have had anything to do with any art deal between the mid-30s and 1946, they must always lose. It's a principle. It's not anybody's law or anything like that. It's just a kind of modern principle, which I agree with.
So, could there be any more Cornelius Gurlitts out there with hidden masterpieces just waiting to be found?
To get well into the 21st century and for these things still to be coming up, it is quite an eye-opener.
I don't think they're going to be everywhere. I think it's probably a very rare case.
There are quite a lot of people who've got the odd work or two, but something of this scale has not emerged in many, many years. I think it's unlikely there are many people who've got something of that size stashed away secretly.
I think this is a real one-off, and the fact that he was such a reclusive character made this possible, but it's certainly not going to be something that happens every day.
It will probably take years to sort out the pictures and what category they fall into and whether any were looted, and the whole saga will take a long time to resolve.
At an antique store in London, a remarkable discovery has been made that has thrown light on the bloody end of the Tsars of Russia and the birth of the Soviet Union.
Well, it was a miracle. We were here at Wartsky, and in through that very door behind you walked a gentleman. He was the most unassuming, unprepossessing individual, but in his hands he had a sheaf of photographs.
This mysterious stranger had pictures of a lost treasure made by the legendary Carl Fabergé, a master jeweler and favorite of the Russian Imperial court. Like the Romanovs, Fabergé himself would ultimately be a victim of the terrifying Russian Revolution. And one of his greatest creations would go missing for a century, having to survive 2 world wars and a precarious trip to America, before pictures of it finally made their way to London.
This has been the target of our dreams for so long that I recognise it instantaneously. But of course, as an antique dealer, your first reaction is no. You doubt everything. But looking at the images and then looking at him, it had to be true.
50 Imperial Fabergé eggs are known to have been made. Could one of the missing ones have finally been found?
Of course, we couldn't confirm that until we'd handled the object itself.
St. Petersburg, Russia. It was in 1917, in this elegant city on the Baltic Sea, that the story of the Carl Fabergé Company and their legendary Imperial Eggs came to a crashing end.
This is where you made them.
The workshop's downstairs. We used to design our products in here.
The eggs.
Not just commissions from His Majesty.
Citizen Romanov.
Citizen Romanov.
It's a time capsule, it's a portal. I mean, in Russian history, we have this fault line of 1917, and each and every one of these pieces catapults us back to that time when there were beautiful Grand Duchesses, a hemophiliac heir, a mystical Rasputin, and all of these people who were annihilated.
I saw them once. The eggs. I was a boy. My grandfather took me to your exhibition.
Each one of these pieces tie us back to an aristocracy, a religion, a system of governing that's absolutely gone, and they're the only tangible evidence that these people ever lived.
He was at Bloody Sunday. Your friends, Imperial Guard, shot him. Right here. He was just an old man. I wish I'd smashed the eggs when I'd had the chance.
So how had it all gone so horribly wrong for Fabergé and the aristocracy that adored him? And just what happened to the Fabergé eggs? The story begins in the same city where it ended, St. Petersburg.
The Fabergé family originally came out from France. They were refugees from the repeal of the Edict of Nantes, that's to say they were Huguenots, Protestants being persecuted by Louis XIV, and they fled eastwards from there.
Carl Fabergé, known sometimes as Peter Carl because he was christened that, born in 1846, schooled in the German school in St. Petersburg.
His father owned a small jewelry shop. It was a small jewelry shop, but in a smart area. His father clearly had an eye for Carl becoming something greater than just the jeweler he had been.
Fabergé had such extraordinary talent, and his workshop was so extraordinary. The other thing is that he could be considered a foreign citizen. But being foreign in St. Petersburg was not at all unusual. It was a very, very cosmopolitan city.
He very much planned his education to give him an exposure to Western art, to some of the great jewelry treasures around Europe.
The training that he received when he was abroad with his family, studying the collections of museums in Paris and London, and returns to Russia, and at the tender age of 26 takes over his father's firm.
In Russia, at the end of the 19th century, though, one had to get the attention of the Tsar to really make a name for yourself. And that was especially the case at the time of the autocratic Alexander III.
Alexander III was so horrified by his own father, who was generally a liberal and a progressive, that he decided to reverse every reform. On the other hand, there was quite a lot to be said for Alexander III. He was almost the only Russian leader never to declare war on another country. He was also an extremely brave and powerful man. Perhaps his major mistake was not preparing his son, Nicholas II, to rule.
Carl Fabergé implemented a plan that would eventually catch the eye of this imperious Tsar. He started working on restoring ancient Scythian jewelry, which had recently been excavated from the Black Sea.
He works on a volunteer basis at the Hermitage, appraising and repairing objects without invoicing the court.
And it all really paid off for him in 1882. There was an exhibition of Russian art at which Fabergé exhibited, and what he was exhibiting was pieces derived from those Scythian artifacts, which appealed hugely to the Russian public, because they gave the impression that Russia had this art-rich prehistory to compete with anything in the West. That exhibition was visited by the Russian royal family, and the Tsarina, Maria Feodorovna, bought the Tsar a pair of cufflinks from the Fabergé stand, cufflinks with a cicada motif. So that was the first time he sold something to the Russian royal family.
This brings him favor because in 1885 he's awarded the Imperial Warrant.
Having been awarded the coveted Imperial Warrant, Carl Fabergé starts work on what would be the beginning of a long line of Easter gifts. The first hen egg.
The first Imperial egg was presented in 1885 by the Tsar, Alexander III, to his wife, Maria Feodorovna.
It's a deceptively simple egg, and I think it's a great microcosm of what Fabergé does so well. It's white enamel on the outside, it's gold yolk on the inside represented, a chicken.
You can open it up, inside it you find a golden yolk. You can open up the yolk, and inside that you find a golden hen. Inside was an imperial crown and a pendant. So it was like a matryoshka, you know, one of these Russian dolls. He was probably wanting something to delight her, something to amuse her.
What better way to celebrate 20 years of marriage and Easter in one, and led to a commission, an ongoing rolling commission that lasted 33 years.
Clearly that first egg worked, and each year the emperor would give the empress an Easter egg from Fabergé. Famously, Fabergé started to get total autonomy in the designs, and with only 3 commands: that each gift should be egg-shaped, that each one should be different from any predecessor, and that each one should contain something of a surprise, something that would delight the empress.
Carl Fabergé would quickly become a favorite of the Russian royal family. But neither they nor he saw the huge changes which were coming to the Russian Empire that would leave both Fabergé and his incredible Imperial eggs in great peril. Towards the end of the 19th century, master jeweler Carl Fabergé had become a firm favorite of the Russian Tsar, Alexander III, and his wife, the Tsarina, Maria Feodorovna. His one-of-a-kind Imperial eggs had become a highlight of the Easter celebration. In 1890, he presented the exquisite Danish Palace's egg, complete with a surprise of folding miniatures. This was followed by the Memory of Azov egg, which commemorated a voyage taken by the future Tsar Nicholas II on the armored Russian cruiser, the Azov, where he narrowly survived an assassination attempt in Japan. The diamond trellis egg, made from pale jadeite, was presented in 1892, and was followed by the Caucasus egg of translucent ruby enamel in 1893. The Renaissance egg of 1894 would prove to be the last presented by Tsar Alexander III to his wife Marie. That same year, the Tsar suddenly fell ill with an incurable kidney disease, and he died at the age of only 49. The sudden death of the Tsar left his son, the terribly unprepared Nicholas II, to take the throne. And things got off to a dreadful start when, at a celebration of his coronation at Kadynka Fields near Moscow, a stampede killed over 1,300 people. The public at large was not impressed with Nicholas's response to the tragedy.
He was doomed after the Kadynka Fields catastrophe. He wasn't strong like his father. He wasn't expecting to be Tsar. He was only in his 20s. He had kept an iron grasp on the people. And then Nicholas comes along and he's a bit more diffident.
To begin your coronation with a mass death of the population was bad, and then worse still, he should go to a ball at the French embassy on the same day of this disaster. So that, in fact, did his prestige an enormous damage from which he never recovered.
His strength and his weakness was that he was slightly normal, and he rather liked normal life. He liked chopping wood, being with his family, and smoking, which he did a lot of the time.
Fortunately for Fabergé, though, Nicholas continued the tradition of Imperial Easter eggs, and in fact, 2 were now requested each year. One for Nicholas's mother, the now Dowager Empress, and one for the new Tsarina, Alexandra, who unfortunately was just as unpopular as the Tsar.
Tsarina Alexandra came from the small German court of Darmstadt, and she was known as the German one. That was a problem for her to get over to start with.
Some Russian empresses have overcome this, but she was extremely tactless. She was convinced that Russia should be an absolute monarchy, and she pushed her husband, and she had extremely bad judgment.
She didn't enjoy balls and dances. She thought that the Russian aristocracy were very decadent. Meanwhile, the Dowager had been very fun-loving and was very popular. The Tsarina had a hard act to follow, and she didn't really manage.
The first pair of eggs given was in 1895, when Tsarina Alexandra received the rosebud egg and the Dowager received the blue serpent clock egg. This egg would eventually end up in Monaco, where it became a treasured possession of Princess Grace.
Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip take the royal drive along this superb course. Princess Grace and Prince Rainier are guests.
3 other eggs also ended up in royal possession, becoming the property of Queen Elizabeth II. The colonnade egg, the basket of flowers egg, and the stunning mosaic egg. It seems that Fabergé has always been a favourite of royalty right from the days of his very first royal client, the Dowager Empress, Marie Fyodorovna.
Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
You look well, Master Jeweller.
I persevere, Your Majesty.
Yes. You are a wonderful reminder to the court that our generation is not past quite yet. We persevere indeed.
I think Fabergé had an intimate relationship with virtually every member of the imperial family. Their relationships and their loves, their passions, their lusts and so on were expressed through the exchanges of these gifts. So all of the emotions which are treasured in them as these historical figures coalesced into these Fabergé objects.
On behalf of His Imperial Majesty, it is the great honor of the Carl Fabergé Company to present this year's Easter gift.
Maria Fyodorovna was, unlike Nicholas II's wife, she had extraordinary charm. Once she was the Dowager Empress, she was the most respected member of the royal family.
The Dowager was generally more charming and outgoing than the Tsarina, and she had established a good relationship with Fabergé. He had obviously prepared the surprises very well. She'd always liked them.
Marie Feodorovna, she was essentially the same age as him. She was his original client. She received those original eggs. And there are certainly letters from her, for example, to her sister, who was our own Queen Alexandra here in the UK, in which she said, Fabergé brought the most wonderful egg. I told him you were a genius. Clearly, she liked him.
I hope Your Majesty is pleased.
My dear, dear Fabergé, you truly are an unparalleled genius.
Fabergé's connection with the imperial family was the ultimate cachet, and his workshop was soon producing an array of items for other European aristocratic families. He even opened up an international store in London.
That idea of a feudal society, if it was the fascination of the court, it quickly became the fascination of every level of society. The aristocracy, the traders, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, they would all want to participate in that royal fascination. And it wasn't just in Russia. In England, exactly the same thing happened.
Fashions such as cigarette smoking came to the fore. Fabergé responded very quickly to this with cigarette cases. When you open this, you have not only the case itself and the characteristic thumb piece here, it opens to reveal a signature and a date. So this is when a cigarette case is not only a cigarette case, but it's a case that's been purchased by a Grand Duchess as a gift.
Fabergé is a Russian company, and they were made in Russia, and they are quintessentially Russian. It does have a distinct English flavour, and I think there is perhaps more Fabergé within a mile radius of where we're stood now than there is in the entirety of Russia and America put together.
Essentially, the London shop was started on the back of commissions or requests for objects from the British royal family, and the British royal family had learnt to love Fabergé because of the relationship between Marie Feodorovna and Alexandra.
Edward VII and then Queen Alexandra, the sister of Maria Feodorovna, they were also fascinated by Fabergé, and as a consequence, English society became fascinated by Fabergé.
There's a famous story of I think he was by then Edward VII, being given a present by a friend, saying, actually, I don't particularly want this. If you want to buy me something, go down to Fabergé's shop and look at what he's got.
Although the 50 Imperial eggs are undoubtedly the most desired today, Fabergé did make other Easter eggs for paying customers, including the wealthy Kelch family.
If you were a Russian lady of some stature, you would have chains of miniature Fabergé eggs, and then there were eggs in between that were given the size of hen's eggs, and there were various types, which are all marvellous, and they're all wonderful.
The problem with making stuff for the Russian royal family was the bureaucracy he had to deal with. He did find it more congenial making objects for the newly emerging middle classes, or very rich middle classes, I should say.
Two very prominent European families who commissioned works from Fabergé were the Rothschilds and the Nobels, for whom the Nobel ice egg was made.
They were happy to spend what it required, happy to give him carte blanche, and to take what he made for them. And he made some fabulous objects for them.
Fabergé made 2 eggs every year during Nicholas II's reign, with the exceptions of 1904 and 1905, when no eggs were presented. During this period, Russia suffered a disastrous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. 1905 was an especially bad year, with the Bloody Sunday Massacre being carried out in St. Petersburg and the eventually unsuccessful 1905 Revolution. Work on the eggs resumed in 1906 with the Swan egg, with its automaton miniature. Carl Fabergé had brought his son Agathon into the company, which now had over 500 employees.
Nephrite exterior, watercolour miniatures of the children. Father?
You can do better.
When World War I broke out in 1914, Russia was soon dragged in, and Tsar Nicholas II left the imperial court to take charge of the armed forces. In response, Carl Fabergé made what would turn out to be his last Easter gift, the steel military egg. Presented to the Tsarina Alexandra, it contained a surprise of her husband and son commanding the Russian army. But Nicholas II was never suited to being a military leader, and Russia was grossly unprepared for the war effort.
Once the Germans came to the help of the Austro-Hungarians and pushed the Russian army back, and the soldiers found they had to go into battle with no boots, no rifle, and were told to take it off the first corpse they found, then the whole thing fell apart. Once housewives came out of their houses banging saucepans because there was no bread, then the Tsar had to go.
The imperial family were offered an exile in England, but all the children were ill. They all had measles. And there was also the thought that the situation wasn't as grave as people were making out. So they delayed their departure. George V, who was a cousin of the Tsar, took away his offer. It was considered safer to take them to Siberia.
However, the revolutionary Bolshevik forces led by Lenin managed to capture the Tsar, the Tsarina, and their children, and take them to the city of Ekaterinburg, where they came to a grisly end.
Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of your relative's continuing attacks on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has ordered that you are to be executed.
The reason that they were executed was really because where they were kept in the Urals, the White Army was approaching. And the Reds feared, perhaps justifiably, if the Whites captured them again, they would have something to rally the country around once you got the Tsar back. And I think the panicky execution was not due entirely to sheer brutality, but just to deny the opposition in the Civil War as an important symbolic figure.
There's a certain amount of obfuscation about it. I think because perhaps Lenin, at various points, thought it wouldn't be good for him to be named as the killer of the whole family. So there's also a dispute over who gave orders for the Tsar and Tsarina to be killed and who gave orders for the whole family to be killed.
Lenin definitely sanctioned it. I mean, the brutality of the revolution, the Civil War, was so horrific that the deaths of the Tsars fit in with the deaths of millions of others who were shot, tortured, drowned, and so on.
The murder of the Russian royal family meant that Carl Fabergé's life was hanging in the balance, and his amazing collection of works was in danger of being lost forever, which makes the recent rediscovery of one of his imperial eggs all the more miraculous. In July 1918, the Russian royal family was executed and all their possessions seized by the new Soviet state. Carl Fabergé, very much a part of the now extinct Imperial Russia, was in danger of meeting a similar end.
I saw them once. The eggs. I was a boy. My grandfather took me to your exhibition. I'd pestered him about it for weeks.
Did you have a favorite?
In the early 1900s, he built a purpose-built headquarters in St. Petersburg with the shop on the ground floor, floors above that included essentially workshops where a lot of the jewelry happened, although a lot of the other more specialist work would happen in other workshops outside. And then on floors above that, the design studio.
1 ruble, 10 kopecks it cost to get in. You wouldn't even bend down in the street to pick that up, would you? 1 ruble. I didn't know that was more than he made in a week. He was out bloody Sunday.
It's estimated that the Fabergé enterprise, well, he had workshops in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Moscow was where they made silver. He had shops in those 2 places, also Odessa, which was a popular tourist destination, and London, which dealt with most of his international business. And total employees either working for or indirectly for Fabergé, probably about 1,500 at its height.
Your friends, Imperial Guard, shot him. Right here. He was just an old man. I wish I'd smashed the eggs when I'd had the chance.
They had a first stage of revolution, a parliamentary government, but it couldn't end the war, and it couldn't continue the war. The officers wouldn't stop fighting, the soldiers wouldn't go and fight. And finally, a small group of highly organized men, the Bolsheviks, understood how to make a revolution.
I wish many things were different.
Comrade Lenin back in exile, you mean? Bloody Nicholas in his palace.
They understood you don't have to have large numbers, you just take the railway junction and the telephone exchange. Once you hold those 2, everyone else is paralyzed. So you could say it was Lenin's and Trotsky's highly intelligent methods for a small group to take over a large country that finished that stage of the revolution.
You're all looters, war profiteers, parasites, growing fat while the working man dies! But you don't make the world anymore. Time to go, citizen.
Famously, the Bolsheviks arrived at Fabergé's business to take it over. He said, just give me a minute to fetch my hat and coat, and essentially slipped out the back. Soon afterwards, he was smuggled out of St. Petersburg. He ended up in Switzerland, but he was clearly broken by the events of the revolution.
He was not placed under arrest, nor was he dragged to Ekaterinburg and shot, or any of his family members. So his destiny was very different. His holdings were nationalized and eventually found his way to Lausanne, having traveled with his clothes and apparently a collection of wine, and died in Lausanne in 1920.
Fabergé wasn't the only one who escaped, though. The Dowager Empress also managed to flee the revolution despite having been a Tsarina herself. She, along with other members of her family, were taken to safety aboard the British battleship HMS Marlborough.
George V felt very guilty when he heard, obviously, this terrible tragedy. He made great efforts to get the Dowager out and the Tsar's sister Ksenia and all Ksenia's children.
The local Reds never got round to executing members of the royal family. They were too much of a hurry defending themselves. And so she managed to get out on a British battleship.
On the Marlborough, Prince Felix Yusupov, who murdered Rasputin, had 2 Rembrandts, and he was seen on deck with them rolled up under his arm. There was the Fabergé Egg, the Cross of St. George, down in the hold. And the Yusupovs also had other treasures, £20 million worth of jewels and treasures on board, so quite an extraordinary amount.
The Cross of St. George egg was the last Fabergé egg presented to the Dowager Empress. By taking it with her, it became the only Imperial Easter egg known to have left Russia with its owner. Carl Fabergé may have escaped to Switzerland, but his son Agathon, who'd become a key part of the Fabergé company, was not so lucky and remained in the now Soviet Russia.
I think a lot of the enterprise and dealing within Fabergé's world was conducted by Agathon, and I think he did exactly the same after the revolution as he had done before, and he was a conduit himself for the movement of objects out of Russia to the West. And in fact, in Wartski's ledgers, there are references to us buying objects from Fabergé, and the Fabergé was Agathon Fabergé.
Agathon Fabergé managed to escape Soviet Russia himself in 1927. But he had left behind one of the unfinished eggs due to be given to the Romanovs in 1917.
It was found essentially in the Fersman Mineralogical Museum in Moscow. They thought it was a lampstand. It is actually an egg-shaped bit of polished blue glass on a funny sort of cloud-shaped bit of other glass. They now know, in fact, that that was going to be the egg for Alexandra Fedorovna.
The story of the Blue Tsarevich constellation egg reveals the precarious times that faced the imperial treasures after the Russian Revolution. Both Lenin and Stalin authorized the sale of many of Russia's greatest works of art to fund the Soviet programs.
The revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. Even if there hadn't been economic collapse as well, it would have changed everything. Economic collapse as well just made it all even worse.
There was so much Russian art, and you could argue that, in fact, Russia had plundered all of Europe in the 18th century. Catherine the Great got an enormous amount of stuff from impoverished English collectors and aristocrats.
One of Lenin's famous commands was loot the looters. That is to say, all these people have been living the life of Riley for the last 50, 100, 300 years. It is now our turn to loot them.
Despite the looting, the smashing, the rotting away, there's still the Hermitage Gallery in St. Petersburg can only display a tiny fraction of what it has.
Countless works of art were sold abroad, including the Fabergé eggs, and their buyers were a very mysterious bunch. They included Emanuel Snowman of Wartski and Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum.
Armand Hammer is a fascinating character, and he was almost the Joseph Devine of his day.
Multi-millionaire capitalist who alleges that he is in fact a communist, and then goes over and makes big deals with Lenin.
He was not a communist, he was a capitalist through and through.
He organized trunk shows through department stores across America and catered to the way that women bought things and made Fabergé pieces accessible to the American public.
Ultimately, he became the agent for the sale of Russian works of art, primarily, almost solely, to America. And so he was the conduit from Russia to America, whilst Emanuel Snowman was a conduit from Russia to Western Europe.
A king's ransom in art jewels, gems from the collection of the late Tsar of Russia on exhibition. Treasure worth many millions procured from the Soviet government after the revolution.
Armand Hammer and Emanuel Snowman were two of the major figures who had facilitated the movement of Fabergé eggs to the West. But one man who wanted to gather them for himself was Malcolm Forbes of Forbes magazine. He went on a spending spree.
Malcolm Forbes was a relative latecomer, and Forbes was possessed by a collecting mania.
He was an obsessive collector. I suppose the great thing about Fabergé eggs is there are only, 50 imperial ones and another 16. So you could actually get the lot. It was one of those things where you could find you had the complete stamp collection.
In a span of 2 decades, Malcolm Forbes managed to get his hands on 9 Imperial Fabergé eggs in total.
His ambition was always to have more Easter eggs than the Kremlin. He never quite got there, but he got very close.
While most of the Imperial Fabergé eggs were sold abroad for foreign currency, 10 did remain in the Kremlin armory and have never left the country.
And one of the great sort of stories and unknowns of these eggs is that we know exactly where they were in Soviet times, we know where they were in Imperial times, and we really know where they were once they emerged in the West. The skullduggery and the mischief of those original and first transactions, we don't know. And so I feel as though there are wonderfully sort of untold stories there involving these sort of ravenous dealers and sort of mischievous individuals.
Malcolm Forbes' determination to collect as many Fabergé eggs as he could helped shoot up the price of these one-of-a-kind treasures. When the winter egg went on sale in 2002, it was bought by a Qatari bidder for $8.7 million.
All done at $8,700,000. Maria, your bidder at $8 million.
My favourite egg is one that was given to Marie Feodorovna in 1913. And that's one of the most striking things about it, is here we are, almost 30 years after that first egg, and you're still getting wonderful creativity. It looks like you're looking through a winter fog as you look through the egg. It's sitting on more carved rock crystal, which is polished so much that it looks like melting ice. And then within the egg, so you can see it through a winter fog, or open the egg and lift it out, is a little basket of enamelled flowers of spring anemones. So you've got a wonderful symbolism there of spring seen through winter.
In 2004, though, Malcolm Forbes' collection of Fabergé eggs would make their way back home to St. Petersburg when they were purchased by the Russian oligarch, Victor Vekselberg.
Vekselberg, I think, spent something like $100 million getting quite a large number of eggs back.
They've gone back to the Fabergé Museum in St. Petersburg, which actually is a fabulous destination for them. Whatever the mechanism of why they got there, where they have ended up is the perfect home for them.
For the longest time, 42 Imperial Fabergé eggs were known to have survived the Russian Revolution, with just 8 remaining lost. But then, out of the blue, an American man arrived at Wartski in London with evidence that one of those eggs had been found. Wartski in London is forever entwined with the history of Fabergé, so it's the only place you would go if you thought you'd found a missing Imperial Fabergé egg. And that's exactly what an American individual recently did.
In walked a gentleman, and he was the most unassuming, unprepossessing individual. He was wearing a plaid American shirt, the quintessential red plaid American shirt, jeans. He asked me by name, and when I came up, he couldn't actually speak to me. His mouth was dry with fear. There was a sort of like a sort of inability to communicate.
Just a couple of years before, a pair of intrepid researchers looked through a 1964 catalogue of the auctioneer's Parker Burnett, now a part of Sotheby's. Within it, they discovered an image of the missing third Imperial Fabergé egg, which had been sold with everyone unaware of its true origin. The only other known image of this egg is from the 1902 Von Dervis Mansion exhibition, where many of the Fabergé eggs had been displayed. But this new discovery proved that the egg had made it to the West, and there was now a far clearer photograph of it. Kieran McCarthy of Wartski was part of an article published by the Daily Telegraph on this catalogue discovery, which gave some hope that the egg may turn up someday, now that it was proved to have survived the Russian Revolution. But little did he know how quickly that article would lead him to the egg itself.
I went out to America pretty much as quickly as my feet and the wings would carry me afterwards. We travelled a long way to a very remote part, and I walked into the kitchen of this house, which is 1,000,000 miles from Imperial St. Petersburg, and sat on a kitchen counter. There was a cupcake, and next to it, the missing Easter egg.
A Google search had proved key in bringing owner and expert together.
He had no idea whatsoever that it was Fabergé. He had no concept that this was a missing Imperial egg. And so he typed into Google, of all things, he typed Vacheron Constantin and egg. What came up was all of the art historical research which I and Wartski had been involved in surrounding this egg. And so, although the miracle of him walking through our door one day was a miracle, the actual link and the reason why he walked through our door was that research.
It proves that these eggs are out there to find. You know, there were 50 eggs. Some of them were destroyed or melted down or disappeared. And we had thought that 8 were missing, and until recently that was the case. And then this third egg appeared.
Well, the egg displays every wonder of Fabergé's work. The first is, it's a very simple construction. It's a reeded gold egg, but the simplicity belies how difficult it is to make. Each one of these reeds is formed by hand by a craftsman at a workbench. They taper at the same rate to an exact point, both at the bottom and at the top. And when you press the diamond at the front, it opens to reveal the watch by Vacher and Constantin. And this scrolling around the bezel of the aperture where it's there is found on many of them. It's the identical engravings on the cradle with garland's egg. And so you begin to see these little sort of hints of what Fabergé has done before and of how Fabergé's craftsmen worked. And another aspect is when you flip the watch up, it sits, which is a beautiful little piece of design which actually allows it to work as not just an Easter egg, but as a clock. And where you really see the absolute tour de force of goldsmithing is not so much in the simple egg, but in the far more elaborate stand. 4 coloured gold roses, and roses are an emblem of love. And so the Tsar and the Tsarina, when they saw this, would know that it was an expression of love. And then the lion paw feet, they're beautifully finished on top, and they are slightly stylized, but very sort of endearing lion's paws. But when you turn it over and look at the base, the pads and the underside of the feet are as beautifully represented. And of course, the Tsarina would never have seen that because it would have sat like that. This is one of the most sophisticated pieces of goldsmithing from Fabergé's or anybody else's hands that has ever been created, and it would have been a gift appropriate for a Tsar.
But what of the 7 Imperial Fabergé eggs that are still missing? Well, one of them is called the cherub with chariot egg, and it could be seen in the same photograph from the 1902 von Dervis exhibition that featured the 3rd Imperial egg. Sitting sneakily behind the Caucasus egg, you can see the wheel of the cherub with chariot egg, and can catch a glimpse of it in the reflection of the glass casing. This artist's interpretation shows what the egg could look like if you happen to notice another £20 million treasure at an antique store. But this isn't the only Fabergé egg of which we have but a faint glimpse. The 5th egg in the series is known as the Nécessaire egg, and it featured at a 1949 exhibition of Fabergé eggs in London.
London and a Regent Street jeweller's becomes the setting for an exhibition of the work of Karl Fabergé, that great craftsman of Tsarist Russia. His son, Eugène Fabergé, holds one of the jewel-studded enamel and gold Easter eggs made for the last empress as a gift from the Tsar.
Kieran McCarthy, who was instrumental in finding the 3rd Fabergé egg, has also brought us closer to uncovering this one when he found an image of it in the back of a photograph taken at the exhibition.
That's one of the most frustrating sort of events in my life. Wartski is an Edwardian company, and our ledgers are arranged that on the left-hand side it shows what the object is. And I looked across where we have the name of the buyer, the address of the buyer, and how much they paid. So I thought, if Mr. Bloggs lives at 4 Bloggs Square, I can go knock on 4 Bloggs Square and find the egg within. But I look across and it said a stranger. And Wartski's discretion, as it is with this egg, we cannot reveal who bought or sold this egg, and there is no way of telling where it went.
The exquisite work of the man who was court jeweller and goldsmith to Russia's royal house still mirrors the splendor of an age that is no more.
Although the Nécessaire egg featured at this exhibition, it was not known at the time to be the 5th Imperial Easter egg.
The Nécessaire egg was never recognized as an Imperial Fabergé egg, but importantly, it was recognized as a Fabergé egg. So this egg here was never known to be Fabergé, and so because of that, it was never likely to be saved because it was Fabergé, and as a result, this danced on the precipice of the melting pot over and over again. It was sold to almost certainly an English customer, and it was only in 1952, so it is likely to have survived, and that one I feel in my instinct has survived.
Of the 5 eggs where we've got no trace of them coming to the West, it's possible that they'll emerge one day. It's equally possible that they were destroyed in the whole chaos around the Revolution.
Despite the slim chances of discovery, there are photos of 2 of these 5 most elusive Fabergé eggs: the 1909 Alexander III commemorative egg and the 1903 Royal Danish egg. Oddly, we also have the surprise of the 1897 mauve egg, but not the egg itself. The missing Royal Danish egg is the intriguing one though, as it was presented to the Dowager Empress whilst she was away at her original home of Copenhagen in 1903. It's not known for sure if she ever brought the egg back to Russia, so it may be the case that something is amiss in the state of Denmark.
You just never know, and that's partly the mystery of them. And I think that's why this particular egg is so significant, because it is one of the missing ones.
Well, it seems possible that it might be there. She wasn't very keen to pass anything on when she was alive, and she used to say, "You can have my treasure when I'm dead." So, yeah, it could be, yes.
When you know the history, it becomes rather blasé. You know, oh, I know that one. I've seen it there. It was exhibited there, and it went there, and they paid so much, and they did this. It's the ones you don't know about that actually excite the mind and the fascination.
All 7 of the missing eggs are ones that were presented to the Dowager Empress Marie Fyodorovna. It's known that she escaped Russia on the HMS Marlborough with the Cross of St. George egg on board.
The Dowager took the egg with her, presumably to England. I think then Ksenia, her daughter, then Vasily, her youngest son, ended up with it, and then he sold it.
But there's no reason why this should have been the only egg she took with her. It's possible she packed up the Empire Nephrite egg and mauve egg, or any other of the missing ones, such as the second hen egg with sapphire pendant. These are the only 3 eggs left, of which we have no images. But that doesn't mean they're not out there.